Good afternoon and welcome to the Land Use and Transportation Committee meeting for today, Monday, September 25th. I am the acting chair, Aaron Peskin, joined by committee member Katie Tang, as well as Supervisor Jeff Sheehy. Our clerk is Ms. Erica Major. Ms. Major, do you have any announcements?
Yes, please make sure to silence all cell phones and electronic devices. Completed speaker cards and copies of any documents to be included as part of the file should be submitted to the clerk. Items acted upon today will appear on the October 3rd Board of Supervisors agenda unless otherwise stated.
Thank you, Ms. Major. We have two items on today's calendar, both brought to us by Supervisor Sheehy, who has requested that we call item 2 out of order. So, Madam Clerk, could you please call item number 2?
Sure. Just for communications, Supervisor Farrell has found an appointment, Supervisor Sheehy has been appointed in place of Supervisor Farrell.
Excellent. I have not received that, but I believe you because you are the committee clerk. So, and I guess we should make a motion to excuse Supervisor Farrell made by Supervisor Tang. We'll take that without objection. Item number 2, please.
Item number 2 is an ordinance amending the police code to prohibit the assembly, disassembly, sale, offer for sale, distribution, offer for distribution, or storage of bicycles and bicycle parts on the public right-of-ways under certain conditions and with certain exceptions, and authorize the Department of Public Works to remove and seize bicycles and bicycle parts following issuance of a notice of violations.
And before I turn this over to the sponsor, Supervisor Sheehy, I want to thank him for listening to some of the comments and concerns that led me to dissent in committee before it went to the full board, and just want to acknowledge this is a kinder and gentler revision to the original legislation. And with that, Supervisor Sheehy.
Thank you. So this item was introduced back in February to address the very real problem of bicycle chop shops on our streets. And just to be clear, a bicycle chop shop consists of the following: 5 or more bikes, a bicycle frame with the gear cables or brake cables cut, 3 or more bicycles with missing parts, 5 or more bicycle parts, and it's located on any street, sidewalk, passageway, or other right-of-way or public property. What is not a chop shop is a person operating under a valid business license, the owner that is present during the repair of his or her single bicycle, items being offered at a garage or yard sale, items being used in connection with an event sponsored by a nonprofit. Although the initial proposal was to lead with our police department, I'm convinced that the Department of Public Works is the most appropriate lead agency. We are not trying to criminalize people. We're trying to keep our sidewalks clear and not have illegal businesses operating. Before recess, we made amendments at the full board that shifted primary responsibility from the police department to the Department of Public Works, because I believe this will be more effective at removing chop shops. I will offer additional amendments today to move these provisions from the police code into the Public Works code to further demonstrate our commitment to addressing a matter of sidewalk clutter with Public Works staff. We have Larry Stringer, Deputy Director for Operations for the Department of Public Works, here to present on this item. So, Director.
Good afternoon, Mr. Stringer.
Afternoon, Supervisor. Public Works is here to support the legislation, and we feel that we will be able to basically, hopefully, reduce some of the clutter on the sidewalks with this legislation, which is one of the things that we struggle with on a daily basis, related mainly to encampments. And other than stating that as it currently stands, we might have a storage capacity issue, but other than that, we're fine with it as it currently stands.
Any questions for Mr. Stringer? All right. Any additional comments from members of the committee? Seeing none, are there members of the public who would like to testify on this item number 2?
Hi, my name is Fred Winograd, and I live in the Supervisor Sheehy's district, and I fully support this measure. I supported it before. I believe it is improved, and I think it will not cure all the problems, but will certainly put a dent in the litter and the despicable use of our sidewalks for well, I think it will improve the situation, and I really support it and hope you do too. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, supervisors. My name is Dale Smith. I'm a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, and I also work with the Coalition on Homelessness. I don't believe this bill as stands is going to do anything more than continue to criminalize the homeless. Civil asset forfeiture is something that the city of San Francisco hasn't stood for in the past, and I believe this is a rocky road that we're going down if we do decide to go through with this. The reality is that this does nothing to address bike theft, gang activity, people creating chop shops and going into people's homes and stealing bikes. It's just going to further criminalize the homeless. Also, I personally don't believe that this is going to completely remove the duties of SFPD from them and put it into the Department of Public Works. The reality is that anytime someone from the Department of Public Works goes to pick up refuse at an encampment, they have to have members of SFPD present with them because they feel unsafe. At least that's how the policy is determined. So I think the reality is it's just going to put in more city resources, and it's not actually directly going against the problem that we face today. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker. Go ahead, sir.
Hello, my name is Dayton Andrews. I'm the human rights organizer at the Coalition on Homelessness. First, I want to make it clear that I've been contacting Supervisor Sheehy's office for almost a month now, every Wednesday morning, asking when this item was going to come up into this committee. And I was consistently told that no chance it's going to come up next week. And I was told that last week. And we were pretty blindsided finding it was coming up in this committee, so I think that's a little mean-spirited. There's not many people coming up today to talk about this issue, which I think is very important. I think there's this impression that by having DPW do this new function, it is somehow going to make this bill nicer. It is not nicer. This is a mean-spirited bill that will target unhoused people and violate their rights to due process as well as their rights to property. It's creating an additional it's creating more bureaucracy that DPW is going to have to deal with. It is also setting up an instances for escalation. I mean, we're giving DPW powers that it does not have that actually clash with the current property policy that DPW follows. And it's going to create more situations where police are going to get called into encampments. Yes, this is no longer an administrative citation. It is a notice of violation. Yes, but you're still, when you look at the bill itself, you're still creating a recipe for escalation. You're still violating the rights of people simply for being unhoused. There are a lot of different solutions that the department, that the local politicians need to be researching about how to address crime, how to address property theft. This is really just a mean-spirited attempt to seem as if we're doing something by creating a new legal definition. But practically, we're only going to see an escalation of the violations of due process and the rights to property that we see on the street already. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, Chair Chair Peskin and supervisors. My name is Brian Wiedenmeyer. I am the executive director of the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition. Since Supervisor Sheehy introduced this legislation several months ago, we have heard from many, many members on the topic of bicycle theft and open-air chop shops. While we were not able to support the legislation in its original form, we feel we are now comfortable supporting this legislation as amended, and we will continue to seek ways to address the really serious problem of bicycle theft in our city. It's one that has a significant impact on the lives of many San Franciscans, particularly those who rely on the bicycle for their livelihood. Substantively, the amendments to this ordinance take away enforcement from SFPD and move them to Public Works, with an emphasis on access to the public right-of-way. This is an issue of safety, particularly for people with disabilities and people biking in Soma and other neighborhoods where bike lanes and sidewalks are frequently impassable. We thank the supervisors, including the author, for their willingness to listen to our concerns and improve the ordinance. While we can support the change, we recognize that the city can do and should do much more to investigate and enact effective solutions to the problem of bicycle theft. We are hopeful that proposed legislation regarding the tools and resources that SFPD uses to investigate property crime, including bike theft, will result in progress toward that end. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next speaker, please.
Hi, my name is Matt Berzina. My wife and I use bicycles as our main mode of transportation. We've both had bicycles stolen. It's one of the reasons I'm really excited that I rode a Ford Go bike here today. I didn't have to worry about my bike being stolen. So I hope we continue to address bicycle theft in the city. I don't think this will do everything. I think this is one part of it, but I encourage you to continue to go after bicycle theft through other channels. As it relates to this, I'm excited about having clear, open pathways in our cities. Particularly, we used to bike through the hairball, and we will not bike through there now, both for fear of safety as well as not having safe passage on our bicycles. So I hope this goes to address that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Good afternoon. My name is Alex Post. I'm a public defender, also a member of Democratic Socialists of America. Over the past several years, Governor Brown, having recognized the overreach of the prison industrial complex, has been vetoing bills that would create new crimes for behavior that is already criminalized under other laws. His message is simple. Instead of going down this road, let's look at the laws we have on the books and consider better approaches. But it's easy to see why new punitive bills crop up. You have a sensational crime in a lawmaker's district or a trend, and you get responses like these. It's easy if I'm a lawmaker to pass the Alex Post Act to prosecute drug dealers who sell opiates that lead to overdoses. I can get great press. I can say I did something about the problem. It's easy to pass legislation creating new crimes or new police enforcement, after all, who is pro-crime. It's much harder to actually address the systemic issues that create the problems to begin with, to address the poverty and lack of opportunity that leads people to turn to dangerous black markets in order to eke out a living, or to address homelessness that is so visible and disturbing. This bill doesn't do anything useful. Bike theft is already a crime. Selling stolen bike parts is a crime. Vending without a permit is already unlawful. Passing this bill will allow you to say you've done something about the problem with bike theft. What it won't do is anything about the problem of bike theft or the underlying problems that lead to it. Finally, another good thing the governor has done is sign a bill to reform California's civil asset forfeiture laws to prohibit the seizure of private property prior to a criminal conviction. Our new Attorney General thinks civil asset forfeiture is an important tool. This bill flips the Constitution on its head and puts the burden on citizens to prove to the government that they are entitled to possession of property. I urge this body to adopt Governor Brown's view and reject Jeff Sessions' view. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next speaker.
Thank you, supervisors, for your time. My name is Lenina Mali, and I'm here representing Compass Family Services. We serve 5,000 homeless families in San Francisco every year. We originally opposed the legislation, and we continue to have deep concerns about it, only because we think about it this way. If a family owned 5 bikes and kept it in their garage, no one would blink an eye whether that was theirs. But now what you're asking taxpayer-funded officials to do is to look at people on the street with their bikes out in the open because they have no homes and target those types of individuals for criminal activity. And that's simply something we believe is dangerous for the already very vulnerable homeless populations in San Francisco. We believe that will focus city resources unnecessarily on criminalizing them, even though this is has been rehoused under Public Works. And we would hope that city resources would be more wisely spent on actually addressing the larger criminal activity associated with bike theft and not just target specific populations that look like they might have it because they have a lot of bikes that they can't house anywhere because they're homeless. So we hope that you think about that aspect of it and the effect that would have on discrimination against homeless populations. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Carolyn Thomas, private citizen. Just want to raise a couple of points that I've heard over the past several months around the objections to the bike chop shop law. One, that it's criminalizing the homeless. One, the legislation has no fine, has no jail term. I don't see how it's criminalizing the homeless population. Two, the Bicycle Coalition has said that it's not perfect. Today they acknowledged that there's changes that they support. I agree it's not the perfect legislation, but it does go along the way. Some positives. One, with the DPW picking up parts, there is the potential to return stolen bicycles to rightful owners. Two, it does create rite of passage. Three, it does balance some of the sidewalk issues that I have as a private citizen, either using muni stops or the sidewalk, public places. Lastly, I have heard that this would potentially take away the livelihood of some homeless people that maybe are recycling parts. As an observer of people that are recycling my garbage, I've never seen anybody recycle any part, nor have I seen any bicycle owner put parts into their recycling bin or out by the curbside. Thank you. I support the legislation.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Hi, my name is Evan Owski. I'm a member of Democratic Socialists of America San Francisco chapter. I'm also a member of the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition and an avid cyclist myself. I rode my bike here. I've had a bike stolen in the past 3 years in San Francisco, and so bike theft, as any bike owner will attest to, is a major problem here. However, I don't think this bill will do anything to address it. It simply provides a double standard by which homeless people are treated differently than housed people. Housed people are allowed to have more than 5 bicycle parts, and they're not going to be targeted by police or DPW. This bill would allow DPW to confiscate property without any real standard for actually proving that the property is in fact stolen. So by that, it violates the Fourth Amendment. So I'm going to speak out against this bill, and I think that the latest revisions that have been made to it don't really address the fundamental disparity and the Fourth Amendment issue.
Next speaker.
Supervisors, Jim Lazarus, San Francisco Chamber of Commerce. I could go through my phone and show you photo after photo of chop shops on Montgomery Street in the heart of the financial district, week after week. These are not people who got parts out of recycling or somebody gave them an old bike and they took it apart. These are people that need help. There's no doubt about it. They're homeless. They've got drug addiction problems. It may be a way that they're making a living, but they're making a living on city streets with stolen property, making a mess out of those city streets as well. Any step that we can do to help the homeless, short of allowing illegal activity to occur on the street, should be done by the city. This is a step in the right direction to clean the streets of the city, to stop bike theft, and it's a first step that we need to do for a lot of chronic property crimes that are occurring all over San Francisco. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Hi, Jennifer Friedenbach, Director of the Coalition on Homelessness. So I think the previous speaker made my point for me. Just because someone has bicycle parts doesn't mean they steal them. And what this legislation does is paint a picture of all homeless people as thieves. And yes, a lot of the chop shops he's seen are people who are engaging in honest recycling. We know this because we do constant outreach to homeless people. We're really connected to the community. That's not to say there's no stolen parts that are coming up in those areas or that no homeless people steal. Some housed people steal and so do homeless people. There's a real Orwellian twist to this legislation that we really have issue with. If you are an unhoused person, you have no way in this legislation, it is changed from the last one, but you have no way for rightful owners who are unhoused to get their property back without paying a fee. Specifically, the legislation, you can call for a hearing, but the hearing measures whether or not you had 5 or more bike parts in an open space. And if you did, you go forward, and the only way to get your property back is to pay an impound fee equal to what the cost of DPW impounding those parts and storing them are. That's simply not fair. Housed people, on the other hand, do have a way to get their property back when they're the rightful owners. There's a real clear discrepancy in this legislation that's highly problematic. That's saying if you're outdoors and you have 5 or more bicycle parts, we are allowed to take that property from you, and it's also unconstitutional. We have already laws in place where you need probable cause in order to take this stuff. This ordinance violates Fourth Amendment, People versus Williams, Miranda versus City of Cornelius, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of precedents for how the city can confiscate homeless people's property. And this flies directly in the face of what is supposed to happen, even for the Department of Public Works, who has specific guidelines on how to confiscate property. It doesn't even follow those.
Hello, my name is Kelly Cutler. I'm a human rights organizer with the Coalition on Homelessness. And this legislation has just been baffling from the get-go, where it just doesn't make much sense. They had done an assessment of the issue with bike theft, and the city hasn't followed through on the actual recommendations that will actually impact bike theft. And so, first off, why don't we try that? It was laid out and it was showing how we can do that. Also, this is definitely targeting folks that are forced to live on our streets. It's already such a huge challenge with people's belongings, where we're constantly filing claims because they're being illegally taken. And I've actually talked to DPW workers about this, and they don't understand it either. They don't understand why this is and how it got shifted to them, where that changed it up a bit, but it just doesn't make sense. And so I would encourage you not to support this.
Are there any other members of the public who would like to testify on this item? Seeing none, public comment is closed. Supervisor Sheehy, you indicated that you have amendments that will take this out of the police code, which is the amended version you introduced in late July, and would you like to speak to those?
Yes, thank you. And I would like to note that the Small Business Commission is supporting this legislation. This really isn't about crime. The reason they're supporting it are the relevant reasons. First of all, Public Works is the appropriate body to be responsible for ensuring public access to sidewalks. Unpermitted bicycle sales on sidewalks constitute an unlawful encroachment on the public right-of-way. There are existing options to obtain permission to operate in a lawful manner. Individuals or bicycle parts vendors should be required, like any other small business or resident, to seek the appropriate permits to operate or encroach on the public right-of-way. Now, I'll describe the amendments being introduced. The Department of Public Works, rather than the Police Department, would implement the chapter. It would be in the Public Works Code rather than the Police Code. For reference, the amendments begin on page 1, line 22. DPW would issue a notice of violation, also referred to as a NOV, and the chop shop items would be held for 30 days. Page 3, line 11 to 17, 20 to 22. Under these amendments, a person may appeal to DPW anytime within 30 days. The appellant is entitled to a hearing within 3 days. The burden of proof is on DPW. Page 4, line 8, page 5, line 6. After 30 days, either the person receiving the notice or another person proving lawful ownership may reclaim bicycle parts. Page 5, line 7 to 22.
So what is the burden of proof?
Affidavit suffices. So there's the option to just do an affidavit saying that these are your parts. But we have to clear the right-of-ways.
I'm just interested in maybe through myself to Mr. Givner, there are some constitutional assertions, I assume, that Mr. Pradhan signed this as to form because It is the view of the city attorney that this is constitutional, and I don't recall having gotten a confidential memo saying otherwise. Mr. Givner, you want to address that and talk about the burden of proof question?
Sure, Deputy City Attorney John Givner. As to the constitutional question, as with all ordinances signed by our office, our signature on the ordinance indicates that there are colorable arguments to defend the ordinance if challenged. Happy to advise you or the board confidentially on any specific claims that have been made, but suffice to say, we feel that the ordinance complies with the Fourth Amendment and could, and we would defend it against any Fourth Amendment challenge. On the burden of proof question, the department must establish by clear and convincing evidence that the ordinance has been violated. That is, that there were 5 or more bicycles being distributed or offered for sale, or assembled or disassembled, or that a bike frame with gear cables or brake cables broken, etc. One of those 4 prohibitions has been violated. The department must establish that fact. And that the owner of the bicycle or bicycle part was not present during the repair of a single bicycle.
So the issue is not ownership. The issue is the number of parts, et cetera. That's all. That's the burden of proof.
Correct. Although the city cannot cite for a violation of this ordinance if the owner of the bicycle or bicycle part is present during the repair of his or her single bicycle. So ownership could be a disputed question in one of those hearings.
All right. So we have before us a amendment taking this out of the police code and putting it into Article 20 of the Public Works Code. Is there a motion to adopt those amendments?
So moved.
Made by Supervisor Tang. We can take those without objection. I mean, let me say this about that. While I still have concerns about the legislation, I do want to say that it has moved a long way from what I felt at first really was criminalizing behavior and was more aimed at that than dealing with bicycle theft. And while some of those concerns remain, I want to say that, as I said at the outset, that I think Supervisor Sheehy has made some reasonable steps to make it less objectionable. And given that it really is a problem throughout the city, and including my district, which we heard a little bit of testimony about, let's give it a whirl and see if it works or not. And with that, colleagues, why don't we send this to the full board with recommendation without objection. Next item, please.
Item number 1 is a hearing to address increased traffic congestion downtown and in our neighborhoods, consider increases in traffic caused by increased development and the prevalence of transportation network companies.
Supervisor Sheehy.
Yes, thank you. Today, we are here for a hearing regarding congestion on our streets. I've called this hearing today to address increased traffic congestion downtown and in our neighborhoods. The focus of today's hearing is to consider increases in traffic caused by increased development and the prevalence of the transportation network companies. I'm grateful to the members of various city departments and agencies who are here to contribute to this hearing. So first, could we hear from Tom McGuire, Director of MTA's Sustainable Streets Division, here to present on this item?
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Tom McGuire, Sustainable Streets Director at the SFMTA. Thank you for the opportunity to come here today to talk about what we're doing and what we're seeing with traffic congestion on our city streets. I want to start by saying that, as some of my colleagues will say in their presentations, Traffic congestion in San Francisco is certainly nothing new. We have, I've personally read reports going back to the 1930s, complaints about traffic congestion and gridlock, both downtown, as you said, Supervisor, and also in our neighborhoods. So we're a city where we really aren't widening or building any wider streets, and we're not building any more freeways, and so we need to manage congestion on the rights of way and the capacity and resources we have. We think that the best way to address traffic congestion is to give people choices. And so if we, as the managers of the system, can give people as many choices as possible so they don't have to experience that congestion every day, that's the best thing we can do. And I think some of those efforts are paying off. The graph on the screen shows that since 2015, fewer than half the trips in the city are being made by private automobiles. So our historic investments in Muni, in walking and biking infrastructure are paying off. Those, of course, are not just decisions we've made recently. We're building on a policy framework that dates back to previous supervisors, previous mayors who put in place the Transit First policy in 1973, which has led to rapidly increasing Muni ridership and investment, and more recently, the commitment that this board and the mayor have made to Vision Zero, to ending the 30 traffic fatalities we have on our streets every year. Having said all that, that doesn't mean that we don't take very seriously the job of reducing congestion and mitigating its impacts on our streets, because it certainly has very negative impacts on the city's economy and quality of life. So one of the most visible tools we use is our parking control officers. On any given day, 140 parking control officers are out on our streets doing things like reducing double parking, preventing parking in bike lanes and transit lanes, and making sure that the parking rules are followed to reduce congestion both downtown and our neighborhoods. It's also notable that every afternoon a large number of those officers put away their ticket books and come downtown and stand at the most congested intersections in the city, south of Market and at the approaches to the Bay Bridge. Without their efforts, those areas would be completely gridlocked and no traffic would flow. Of course, our resources are limited, so we do prioritize deploying our PCOs to the worst hotspots in the city and to particular hot topics like blocking the box. And in the fiscal year that just ended, we issued over 7,000 citations for don't block the box violations. Another thing we can be doing is to make sure that our curbs and our on-street parking resources work as well as possible. Double parking is one of the single biggest causes of congestion in our neighborhoods, in our neighborhood retail and commercial districts. And if we can set up parking regulations that let more customers, more visitors get to the curb, park legally, let more deliveries be made from the parking lane rather than from the traffic lane, we can reduce that double parking and the impacts it has. I'll remind you that starting in 2011, MTA undertook an experiment where we varied the price of parking, varied the parking time limits, and varied some of the parking rules in 8 neighborhoods around the city, and we were able to find ways to reduce the amount of time people search for parking spaces by about 40%, reduce the number of miles they drove circling around and around looking for parking by 30%, and reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that their tailpipes put out. So without increasing or decreasing the number of spaces available to park, we can use some of our policy and tools to make the impacts of double parking disappear. We also have some automated enforcement tools. Thanks to your support and the state legislature, we are able to put forward-facing cameras on our buses, and those allow us to photo enforce really egregious behavior like stopping, parking, and leaving a vehicle in one of our red transit lanes. And certainly when you're on a packed 38 Geary on O'Farrell Street at rush hour and you see a single vehicle blocking the entire red lane, 100, 120 people's commute can be affected by behavior like that. Again, in the fiscal year that just ended, we issued over 3,000 citations by camera. We also use cameras to enforce red light violations. This is a partnership between the MTA and the law enforcement agencies. And again, we focus on the most dangerous intersections in the city, both for safety and for congestion reasons. Another area that I think is a huge source of congestion is the extraordinary amount of construction activity taking place in the city today. This graph is showing the increase in the number of construction permits MTA issues. So we issue a permit when a developer or homeowner or resident wants to actually close a lane of traffic to do some construction on their property. back at back in the days of the recession, we were issuing about 1,200 of these permits every year. Again, calendar year 2016, we issued almost 4,000 of them. So there's an extraordinary boom in construction taking place right now, and we are definitely feeling the impacts of that on our streets. Again, we're not powerless to manage that construction. We have a great set of regulations called the Blue Book. I'm happy to share a copy of this with your offices if you'd like. It stipulates exactly how we expect construction to be managed on the streets. It's kind of like the Bible, and if it has a commandment, it has commandments like thou shalt not block a lane of traffic downtown at rush hour. So we really expect contractors to follow those rules, and we have a robust inspection and permitting operation within MTA where our traffic engineers go out and try to make sure those rules are not being violated. Likewise, we have a signal shop that goes out 100 times a month to fix damaged, broken, or mistimed signals, which is largely about safety but has a positive impact on congestion. As I said before, we're trying to improve our curb management. We get almost 1,000 applications a year for color curbs, and certainly white curbs and yellow curbs are great ways to encourage passenger loading to take place at the curb rather than out double parked in traffic. And we're constantly working with stakeholders, 311 calls, your offices, and other residents who ask us to make tweaks to the traffic system, adding a left turn lane, banning a turn, doing things to both make the streets safer, but also to reduce some of the congestion in our neighborhoods. And that's important because we know that as the city grows, particularly in places like South of the Market, where a huge amount of the city's growth is coming, we need to manage the streets for all modes. Multimodal is kind of the byword at MTA. Multimodal means that we have plenty of room for Muni to operate safely and efficiently. So the vast majority of people coming to places like the Transbay Terminal District are coming by mass transit. We also have a robust set of bicycle lanes. We have pedestrian safety on every street, and we still make room for the regional traffic that needs to continue to flow through our streets because we're certainly not building any more freeways here in San Francisco. So as we think about how we manage all this traffic, we know what we've been asked by our policymakers to deliver, and that's complete streets. Whether that's on Market Street, where we need to accommodate large numbers of transit riders, cyclists, and pedestrians, or on streets like the Castro, where we know that residents are demanding a really high quality of streetscape and pedestrian safety. We know that managing congestion plays a part in that, but most importantly, giving people choices, giving people the choices that they can get around the city without having to sit in that congestion remains the best thing we can do to minimize the impact of congestion. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, one is, when you and I have discussed this, but are there robust plans to increase the network of protected bike lanes? For instance, we've been on Valencia Street trying, and actually I was part of a human bike lane protection brigade. Just being out there for an hour to an hour and a half and seeing the amount of traffic that uses that road and the vulnerability, especially to rideshare cars, which routinely use the bike lane as their drop-off lane, is quite perilous. And I think to the degree that we can protect bike lanes, congratulations, kudos to you for putting protection on San Jose so that people could bike there safely, but really having a strong network across the city so not only adults but kids and families can use the bike lanes to get to and fro.
Yes, the parking protected bike lanes are a really important tool in our toolbox. It's kind of it's almost becoming the standard for how we do high volume bike corridors. After being challenged by the mayor last year, we put parking protected bike lanes on 7th, 8th, and 13th Streets south of Market. We've definitely heard your strong advocacy for a parking protected lane on Valencia, and we are going to be working on that this fall. And of course, the other dimension to that is we need to make sure that when we make the changes to parking that those lanes require, that we really make sure we're addressing the needs of the small businesses and merchants on those streets too, so that we can have safe loading and access to the curb, and also safe cycling and less congestion.
And then my other question is about the parking control officers who serve as traffic control officers. And I note that they're really concentrated downtown, but many of us are seeing much more congestion in the neighborhoods. And I know that we've also discussed this, putting PCOs in places where congestion has increased dramatically, and having that be part of the mitigation fees assigned to shuttle companies when shuttle companies are the ones. And we've had conversations with companies that actually employ the shuttles, and a willingness has been demonstrated to place traffic control officers, parking control officers, to manage traffic. You know, I hate to be parochial, but if you look at Diamond and Bosworth, at the southern edge of my district, the shuttle buses use that as a major hub, and that has completely disrupted traffic. That's I know that you guys have done studies, but one of the reasons it doesn't look so bad is that side streets are now thoroughfares because people are dumping off of Bosworth onto other streets. They're using Congo, they're using Diamond, they're backed up Diamond, and it really is something that I know technical fixes have been explored, but the reality is that you get a bunch of buses and everything goes to pieces. A BART lets off and then pedestrians are everywhere. And my great fear is that someone going south on Diamond, turning left onto Bosworth, I can sit out there for a half hour and I can see almost every signal change, running the red light to get that left turn because there is no left turn signal, and narrowly missing stragglers from BART who are crossing against the light, you know, who are trying to cross at the last minute. And it just seems like this is something that could be paid for by the shuttle companies and would be a fix. I certainly would hate to come to a point where someone actually gets hurt before we do something about this. And I'm sure that's not the only place. There are a lot of intersections that are negatively impacted by shuttles that we could use. You know, I wonder about 16th and Market, where we could, at rush hour, use parking control officers with their cost mitigated by fees assigned to the shuttle user, shuttle companies, because it's not all downtown anymore. And I think that's part of everybody's frustration, is that the congestion is really creeping out of downtown, and a lot of factors have changed. And I don't think, you know, we've necessarily been creative enough in exploring options. The other thing, and we are in conversations with MTA, and I do appreciate, as someone whose kid gets on a dedicated bus after school, I know Supervisor Tang has been a real leader on this, and it's been a joy to work with her, but really trying to mitigate the trips that parents take to get their kids to and from school and to and from their additional after-school activities. It really is a bunch of cars get dumped onto the streets because there really is no other way to get around. And frantic parents speeding to school every morning doesn't do well for the kids or the parents. And then the other thing, to what degree are the rideshare companies contributing to this? Are there any strategies to really mitigate the impact of the rideshares, which just seem to be everywhere?
Well, the rideshares are definitely a large factor, and my colleague Jeff Hobson from the TA will have a lot more data about that.
Great. Thank you. And I think he's the next one up, unless any of my colleagues have questions. Thank you, Mr. McGuire.
Good afternoon, supervisors. I'm Jeff Hobson, Deputy Director for Planning at the San Francisco County Transportation Authority. And I think my role in this session today is to give some of the big picture data on how much congestion we're experiencing in San Francisco, put it in the context of a little bit of our growth and rebounding economy and the choices people make every day about how they get around. And then, as alluded in your last question, say what we know and don't know about the impacts of the TNCs. Before starting, I'd like to give a little bit of a nod to Joe Castiglione and our staff in our Transportation Data and Analysis Division. They maintain our model and put together a lot of the data that I'm going to talk about today. So, as the congestion management agency for San Francisco, the Transportation Authority performs every 2 years a monitoring of the speeds on about 200 segments of highways and major streets in San Francisco. And so the data I'm showing here is preliminary. It's from a partially completed congestion management program report that we're working on now and will release sometime this fall. So the data might change, but the message will not. Speeds have been declining over the past 8 years. This graph really shows what you already know and is the reason that you're calling this hearing in the first place. Speeds on our highways and major streets have been going down. During the most recent monitoring period, which was this past May, average speeds on on our major streets were just over 12 miles an hour during the afternoon commute, 14 miles an hour in the speedier morning commute. So it's tough out there. We chose that particular time frame from 2009 to the present because it starts just before TNCs were introduced, which we knew was a matter of concern. It's also important to note that that time frame is also the time frame of our recent economic expansion and rebound from the recession. So a longer time series would have shown more congestion and slower speeds during the previous economic boom. If we looked at the Bay Bridge, we would see the same kind of dynamic. You probably saw the recent data MTC had showing the Bay Bridge corridor, the afternoon commute being the worst in the region and the morning commute being the second worst. So we know our congestion on our roads is a problem. During the same time frame, our mass transit systems have also been becoming much more congested, particularly those serving downtown. Ridership is way up on, these are just some pictures from BART and Muni Metro, but also Caltrain and the ferries coming from the East Bay and the buses coming from the East Bay as well, also have significant ridership increases. So we know our transportation networks are getting much more congested. The question is why? We can't give you a precise allocation of responsibility. We can't say X% of the road congestion comes from population versus jobs versus TNCs versus anything else you might want to say, construction. But we can talk about some of the correlations. And so I'll spend the next couple minutes talking about those. So first, as I think actually my colleague from the planning department will describe in a little bit more detail. This is just a little snapshot of the growth in population and jobs in San Francisco, in this case, again, over this last 8-year period. And we know that the growth in population and jobs has a significant impact. Since 2009, we've added more than 50,000 residents and more than 100,000 jobs. I think it's about 120,000. Adding jobs so much faster than we are adding residents means that lots of those workers have to commute in from outside San Francisco. Lots of in-commuting means lots of longer trips. Longer trips adds to congestion on both roads and transit. It also has other impacts. You've had the affordability crisis. You were just talking about homelessness issues. These things are all connected. So we know growth is one of the major factors. We also know that our transportation choices make a big difference. And this is the good news slide in this presentation. I couldn't fill 5 minutes with just doom and gloom. But over the past 10 years, most new commuters are using public transit, walking, or cycling. This graph shows the change from 2006 to 15. More than half are using transit. Another quarter are walking and biking. Only about 15,000 people are new drivers, but even that represents a significant increase on already congested streets. Now, these surveys, which are based on the census, don't have an explicit category for TNCs. So we presume that they are listed in that blue bar at the top, the other commuters at the top. But we have collected some more information on our own that provides a little bit more detail. So this is information from the TNCs Today report that we released in June and presented to the you and the rest of your colleagues as the Transportation Authority Board, was based on data scraped from the company's APIs. We found that on any given day, the TNC trips start and end, the TNC trips that start and end within San Francisco account for about 170,000 trips. About 15% of the trips that start and end within San Francisco, and on the order of 6,000 or so vehicles on the road at peak times. That's a lot of trips on average. Perhaps as importantly, they occur in the most congested parts of the city at the most congested times of the day. At the peak period, TNCs are about 25% of the vehicle trips in the South of Market area. So 1 in every 4 vehicles in South of Market at peak times is a TNC. So they clearly contribute to congestion. And the question is, to what degree for the city as a whole or in particular hotspots? We don't have a detailed answer to that yet. It depends a lot on what the people using those TNCs would be doing if they were not in a TNC. Would they be driving? Would they be on transit? Would they be walking? Would they just not have taken the trip at all if that new mode didn't exist? So as usual, it gets back to our choices. So that's some of what we know and don't know about congestion in the city. Some of it comes from more residents and jobs, some from TNCs, some from increases in congestion, and from changes in how we travel and for what. We're working on getting a more precise assignment of that percentage responsibility to each major factor. As part of our ongoing studies on TNC impacts, we're trying to estimate some of those in a report we're working on right now and expect to have available to share this winter. Thanks, and I look forward to questions.
Mr. Hobson, we are very familiar with that report and got it at the TA, and thank you for your work. One of these days, the state legislature should allow the city and county of San Francisco to regulate this activity. Supervisor Sheehy.
Yeah, I did have a question. So when you say license registration, what does that mean? It says 21,000 complied with license registration.
So back a couple slides back. I don't remember the date, but it was a year or so ago. The Treasurer and Tax Collector's Office sent out the opportunity to register to about 45,000 people or businesses that they had reason to believe because of business registrations were operating as TNCs. About 21,000 responded and registered as TNC drivers or TNC companies.
So they register as independent contractors, and is what you're saying. An individual
Yes.
driver is required to register as a independent contractor and get a business license, right?
Yes.
So has there been any attempt to enforce the requirement that they have a license? For instance, when they're pulled over, for any sort of traffic violation, do we also ask for evidence of that they have a business license?
I can't say that I know the answer to that question. I don't know whether any of my colleagues from the police department or MTA would know that.
Has the Transportation Authority or the MTA looked at that? I mean, they're clearly breaking the law if they're not. They're independent contractors. They're supposed to register with the city. They should be fined and penalized if they're not complying with that. Has the TA looked at that as possible enforcement of that requirement, which does not involve the state, as a way to get perhaps a better handle on what's going on?
We have not looked at that ourselves. We are in the process of looking at what are the regulatory authorities and what are the opportunities for enforcement at a variety of different levels. And so we are looking into that broadly, but we haven't looked specifically at what are the steps that the city can take towards that end.
Then second, are you looking at the economics of how the businesses, how the TNCs operate? So I know that in London, just last week, and this is where the idea came to me, that they were basically forcing everybody else out of business by using monopolist tactics, by way undercharging what it costs to actually operate the service. You know, the Uber lost $600 million in the first quarter of this year. So are there any attempts to look and see if they're perhaps actually providing a service at substantially less than cost?
That's certainly something that is beyond the scope, certainly beyond the scope of our authority, and probably beyond the scope of our expertise as well.
I'll see if there's some other city agency that can look into that. And then, do you look at the impact of so this is all about trips. What about cars that don't have passengers? So the routine circling of the city, where they park. You know, I'm told that TNC, if you go out to Ocean Beach at night, the parking lot is full of TNCs and you said, where do they come from? Well, a lot of them come from other places in California and end up working here 2 or 3 days a week and then sleeping, you know, at Ocean Beach. Is that part of what you're looking into as well? Is what happens to these cars when they're not with passengers, either drivers staying in the city overnight, which I don't know if I think that's the safest way to operate, people sleeping in their cars and then operating vehicles.
Well, we do have some information about that in the TNC's Today report. Some of it actually here on screen, you can see that we do have information about where a lot of the drivers, of those who did register with the city, where they listed their business license, their business address being, and about 10% of them were entirely outside of the Bay Area as a whole. As part of that report, we did look at how much of the time, to the extent that we could figure it out, how much of the time that the TNC vehicles were in service, how much of that they were carrying a passenger, and how much of that they were not carrying a passenger. They were in service but not yet carrying a passenger. And we found that they drove approximately 1.4 miles of total driving for every mile that they were driving a passenger. So that's something that certainly adds to the congestion, and it is one of the factors that means that even if every person who is riding in a TNC is doing so instead of doing that individual trip in their own vehicle, as a whole, the TNCs are therefore contributing more to the vehicle miles traveled in the city than if those people were driving in solo vehicles. Now, we know that there are much more complex effects, and if someone pays for every trip, they're less likely to make all of those trips. And if TNCs do actually cause people to shed cars, that would be having an improving effect on how much driving there is in the city. But so we do know that there is a significant amount of driving, similar to what Mr. McGuire was talking about with respect to parking. If you can minimize the time people are circling for parking, you can reduce traffic. Similarly, if we could minimize the extent to which TNC vehicles are traveling around without a person in the vehicle, that would be an improvement.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Next, we have Commander Robert O'Sullivan of the unless you guys have a question, of the San Francisco Police Department MTA Division.
Good afternoon, Chairman Peskin, Supervisor Sheehy, and Tang. As mentioned, my name is Commander Robert O'Sullivan. I'm the SFPD liaison assigned to the SFMTA. My areas of responsibility include the San Francisco Police Department Traffic Company. Those are the motorcycle officers, as well as the officers assigned around and on muni vehicles, specifically the cable cars, the trolleys, buses, and light rail vehicles. I work on a regular basis with Directors McGuire and Haley with the SFMTA, as well as Executive Director Riskin. What I'd like to do today is give you a brief overview of what it is that the SFPD is doing as it relates to traffic enforcement and education. And the framework for that, I'd start with a little bit of historical information. In 2014, in this very room, there was a joint meeting between members of the Board of Supervisors and the San Francisco Police Commission. And the reason for that meeting was because in December of the preceding year, in 2013, there was an inordinate amount of traffic-related fatalities, one of which included the death of a young girl who was walking with her mother on Polk Street. As a consequence of the meeting, for which we all met here, was that then Chief Suhr committed that the San Francisco Police Department would adopt a Focus on the Five strategy. And for those of you in the room that aren't familiar with Focus on the Five is in reference to the 5 primary collision factors, California Vehicle Code sections that were identified through a study of collision data conducted by the SFMTA. And those 5 primary collision factors are speed, violation of stop signs, red lights, failure to yield to pedestrians, as well as unsafe turns. Go ahead, thank you. As they're stated there, Chief Suhr's commitment was that the SFPD 50% of our citations issued would be for one of those 5 primary collision factors. Go ahead. Thank you. There are a lot of numbers there on the screen in front of you. What that is a breakout of the violations issued by unit for the period January of this year through August 31st. That's the most recent data. That information is shared publicly and amongst city agencies on a monthly basis. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you will see 51%. We are meeting our goal, which was reaffirmed in August of 2016 by Mayor Lee through an executive order. That came on the heels of the tragic deaths of 2 bicyclists on the same day, one of which was in Golden Gate Park in June, and the second occurred a couple hours later in the South of Market area. Both of those collisions involved excessive speed. So we do a variety. We have like any agency, we have limited resources, and we do a number of different education and enforcement campaigns. You'll see that at the top of your list there that we do speed, LiDAR, and radar enforcement. In October of last year, 2016, the department and SFMTA were the beneficiaries of grant funding to increase our enforcement and education around speed enforcement. Ironically, and more to the point for why this meeting is being held today, as part of our deployment strategy, we found that in the South of Market area, we had to adjust our deployment times because there was so much congestion in the early morning hours that there was gridlock, and we were not seeing any speed violations because of the gridlock. Certainly did not mean that there weren't any speeding going on. We've issued, I believe, nearly 8,000 speed violations year to date, which is an approximate 68% increase over the same time period last year. So, beginning in November, I think October, November of last year, I had a discussion with Executive Director Riskin, and the SFPD historically has been granted or afforded monies to do taxi limousine enforcement. I, as a younger officer, often participate in such enforcement operations, but by the eyeball test, we certainly don't see nearly as many taxi cabs as we used to, nor do we see many limousines or kind of the Lincoln Town Cars, if you will. With that being said, and often being on the receiving end of complaints from members of the Board of Supervisors and from other community members about congestion in the South of Market area, I approached the director and said, how about if we apply this resource towards congestion in the South of Market area, specifically towards those individuals that were driving in what we call the red carpet lanes as well as the bicycle lanes. Director McGuire had spoken about the different modalities, and we know, given what we all see, how congested the city has become. It's very important that Muni operate as efficiently as possible, as well as our bicycling community. Anecdotally, what came out of the enforcement that occurred in November was that I was receiving, by word of mouth, that a good number of the violators were operating as TNCs. And the number that you see here in front of you was, these are numbers of an enforcement campaign that we undertook in April, May, and June of this year. The numbers speak for themselves. As I mentioned, we specifically looked for violations of any motorist without regards to whether there was a TNC or not, violating these particular both vehicle code and transportation code sections. And the math bears out that what I instructed the officers to do was merely identify a TNC through what is most prominently a sticker in the window or markings, and well over 60% of the citations for these enforcement operations, which covered about 10 to 12 different operations, some in the morning time, most during the commute hours in the evening, that over 60% of those violations were issued to TNCs. Thank you.
And what are the 3 felony and 29 misdemeanor arrests?
So those were, the misdemeanors are by and large as a consequence of a traffic enforcement stop. The officers found that someone either had a misdemeanor warrant or was driving on a suspended or without a license, which would be a misdemeanor violation. The 3 felonies aren't so much relevant to the congestion portion of it, but as a consequence of the traffic stop, the officers had probable cause to make a felony arrest.
And what was the percentage of those identified as TNCs?
I'm sorry, sir?
Relative to the 3 felony and 29 misdemeanor arrests, in light of what Supervisor Sheehy said about London, what were the percentage of those TNCs? How many of those drivers were TNC drivers?
That I don't know, but I can follow up.
I'm just looking for an apples-to-apples comparison.
No, I'm sorry if that's at all confusing. It's just a kind of a summary and aggregate number of other violations. But as those 3 and the 29 might apply to TNC drivers, I don't have that information, but I'm happy to research it.
And while, these numbers are actually shocking. And what's shocking is if in the most congested parts of town, as Mr. Hobson was showing on that heat map, at the peak AM or PM, you have 25%, 1 out of 4 cars being a TNC, mostly in the district I represent and the district Supervisor Kim represents. You would think that the number of violations and their correlation to TNCs would be the same 1 out of 4. But what you're seeing is the opposite, which is almost 3 out of 4 of the violators are TNC drivers. Am I making...
For this particular context, yes, for this period of time.
Right.
And to be specific, these were enforcement operations to address congestion in our transit lanes. And you are correct, for these 10 or 12 operations, I think it's about 64, 65%.
Well, the top number, which is drive in transit lane, and while there are transit lanes all over the city, they are more concentrated on this side of the city, on the eastern side of the city, and they're most concentrated in and around the downtown area.
Right.
So what you're telling me is out of 1,700, 1,400, and the numbers off the screen, but...
Out of 1,715, 1,144.
No pun intended, but somebody call the police. This to me seems like a class action, problem. This is unbelievable. We've been, information is power. We've been trying to gather information. That's why we had the Transportation Authority staff do that incredible bit of research that confirmed everything that we thought. But this number is just unbelievable. Basically what you're telling me is TNC drivers violate the law more flagrantly than non-TNC drivers. By a huge percentage.
That is correct. For this snapshot, for this period of time, for those enforcement operations, yes.
We should take this to the State Attorney General. It's unbelievable.
So, can I ask, what would it take to enforce? So you stopped 1,700 TNC drivers. What would it take to? Would it be within your scope to actually make sure that they paid their business tax? Some evidence of. Well, we need an ordinance to do that, to have them visibly display that they have that they've registered as a business within the city and county of San Francisco.
I've got terrible news for you, Supervisor. Senate Bill 182, written by and for the TNC companies, will obliterate our ability to require the operator of a TNC to get a business license in the city and county of San Francisco, with the exception of a handful of instances. That thing went through the state legislature like hot butter. Sorry to ruin your morning.
Thank you.
Afternoon.
Then my other question, so this was a concentration.
But I do want to say that the board and the Transportation Authority Commission and the administration and Ed Riskin have been begging Governor Brown to veto, and he has not yet signed it. So there is a chance that the governor could do the right thing and veto that and give us what teeny little bit of authority that we and the treasurer have in this matter. But Governor Brown, if you're listening, please veto Senate Bill 182.
My other question is that, so this downtown effort was a specific enhanced campaign to enforce?
So specifically, yes, to downtown. So primarily the South of Market area. There were some select areas north of Market Street in the Union Square area, and as well as in the Mission, closer to Market Street. The idea behind the enforcement and the education operations was due to the fact that there's a good number of complaints and concern amongst constituency that both TNCs and non-TNC drivers were driving in transit-only lanes as well as bicycle lanes. So I know there's still a representative from the Bicycle Coalition here probably would agree. We've had Brian Windemeyer and I have had a good number. So when I reference the constituency, the cat's out of the bag. No surprise, Brian and I have spoken many times about vehicles that are driving in the bicycle lane as well as stopped in the bicycle lane.
Yes.
So that was the impetus for this particular action, Supervisor.
I'm just wondering if there are other places where there could be enhanced, just on a spot basis. And I hate to keep coming back to Valencia, but it was really astonishing to see. And I'm actually, there was someone who was run over by a TNC, but the number of TNCs that routinely use the bike lane as the drop-off spot with no real regard for the fact that bicyclists are using it. Is there thoughts to do enhanced enforcement? Again, I know your resources are being pulled all the time.
We're actually doing one right now in the South of Market area.
South of Market?
Today, yes. And we are going to expand it. Today's operation actually is taking place south of Market.
Great, thank you.
Supervisor Tang.
Thank you.
Just hop in. I never called.
Oh, okay.
Sit here.
Thank you. So I know that the congestion management conversation is not just about TNCs, but certainly we do know that it's a large proportion of the problem here, especially after that TA study. And this is not directed to SFPD. It's more of a general comment to some of the various departments that are here. But one thing that was mentioned earlier is that there are quite a few that have come from out of town. And so one message that I have and will continue to share with MTA is that some of them have chosen to sleep overnight in their cars in areas such as the Great Highway south of Sloat. So I think that we need to address that. We need to make sure that we are enforcing our non-vehicle habitation laws that are currently already on the books to further prevent kind of this behavior that is happening where we have so many people coming, and it's very attractive to come from out of town to drive on our city roads. Again, we all know that TNCs have made lives, much more convenient, especially for people who don't drive. But at the same time, what are we doing to kind of encourage people to come from out of town and just park and live in their cars overnight? So that's one thing I wanted to remind MTA or any other department about. The second thing is that, and I think Supervisor Peskin was kind of getting at this a little earlier, which is that, all right, we see the numbers here, and there's an overwhelming number of violations from TNCs, right? So we could continue to do these things in enforcement, but where are we going from here? Is it just so that we have more data, or are we going to actually address it in a way? So, for example, if we're putting in transit-only lanes for MTA so that our buses can go faster, but yet this pattern of behavior may continue where TNCs just just flaunt the laws. How are we stopping that, right? Aside from just fining them, is there something else that we need to be doing? Because otherwise, we're just, there's no point in putting transit-only lanes in. I mean, if I'm driving downtown, I try to respect the rules and I don't drive in the red lane. But I'll always see TNCs going there and being in the way of buses. So I don't think the fines are really doing anything. So I'd love to hear about, well, what is the next step then? Because I don't think that just catching them and slapping them on the wrist will do for the future.
Mr. McGuire.
So that is really the key question. How do we address the issue of the rapidly increasing number of TNCs in a way that is not just a slap on the wrist? So one of the things that MTA has been the lead on, but certainly in partnership with other city agencies, including this board, is we've filed something like 32 regulatory filings with the CPUC. The California Public Utility Commission is where the TNC regulations are taking place. I know we don't like that, but that's the regulating agency. So every time a rule change is proposed there, we're certainly making San Francisco's voices heard, often working with our counterparts in Los Angeles and other major cities who are facing similar issues. So certainly trying to push back against everything from the idea of licensing in the home city, which is what the Assembly bill that Supervisor Peskin referred to the new question about whether TNCs will be able to operate automated vehicles in San Francisco. You know, we continue to try to make the city's voice and, frankly, the issues that you're talking about, Supervisor, heard in Sacramento. That's the level where more structural or organizational change can take place. In the meantime, you know, obviously we're doing everything we can with the PCOs, and certainly PD is doing everything they can with the resources we have.
Do we feel that the CPUC is listening?
The track record so far is the CPUC has not really seen our point of view on this, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's my worry. I mean, you know, in our conversations about working with the CPUC on a number of issues, casino buses being one of them, I just don't know that they're really listening, no matter how much we are advocating for the issues that are here in our city. So again, I don't know. I mean, this could be a whole other conversation about what else we can do to ensure that, you know, our rules of the road are respected. Otherwise, what is the point of, you know, having all the different treatments that we have to make our, to ease congestion for our transit and so forth?
I mean, not only is the CPUC not listening, this thing is like out of a Kafka novel. They will not share public information with the city that the city has repeatedly asked for and have made incredible claims about the confidentiality of what is public information. That's why we had Mr. Hobson and the TA staff, you know, scrape the gigabytes of data that, you know, resulted in that heat map. You know, quite frankly, and I'm very pleased that on the local level, this conversation has evolved and people have gotten frustrated, and the board has now repeatedly taken unanimous action around SB 182 and other things. But having said that, the conversation in Sacramento is actually going the opposite direction. And without pointing fingers, I believe our entire local legislative delegation voted for SB 182 on the Senate side and on the Assembly side. So we've really got to start catalyzing a conversation in Sacramento so that the CPUC will deal with San Francisco and cities like Los Angeles differently than they are now. I just was doing, this is a tangent, but calculating the percentages of these things. So for driving in transit lanes of the violations that the commander and the SFPD have issued, and by the way, thank you, Commander. I know that Ed Riskin sings your praises, and for these 2,656 violations, hats off to you. But for the drive in transit lane violation, 67% of those are TNCs. One would think that they should be a maximum of 25%, just based on, you know, the data that Mr. Hobson was showing us. Driving in bike lanes, 83% of those violations attributable to TNCs. Obstructing bike lanes, 70%. Obstructing bike lanes or a lane of traffic, 76%. Failure to yield to PEDs, 52%. U-turns in business district, 73% are TNCs. Out of the entire, when you add all of these things up, 2/3 of the violations are going to TNCs. I mean, it just seems to me that we need to hear from some smart person in City Attorney Herrera's office, but it seems to me like this is a pattern and practice of a for-profit corporation thwarting, the public safety laws and, anti-congestion efforts of the city and county of San Francisco. I mean, it just seems to me like there's got to be some legal, path here if the state will not allow us to regulate TNCs in the same way. I assume the taxi detail is under you, Commander. Is that correct? Oh, right. That's right. I should remember that. I was the author of that in 2007. I should remember that. But it seems to me that, that we should be able to regulate TNCs in the same way that we've regulated taxis. I mean, so that we can actually make sure that the individuals know their way around the city instead of staring at that cell phone as they're driving, that, relative to safety, the same issue that London's been having. And this conversation is just insane.
So I might have go a different direction based on the statement that actually TNCs create more driver miles than people actually using their own car. So what is the impact on air quality? And since I sit on the Bay Area Air Quality Management Board, I think, is there some opportunity? I don't know if really we have the people in the room today to discuss that, but we certainly, you can't burn a fire in your fireplace when it's spare the air day, and I think this probably is spare the air wet weather. So I would hope that we could look at restricting the number of TNCs in the city via the Bay Area Air Quality Management Board on days when the amount of pollution, assuming that your data is strong, simply because that's dumping a lot of pollution into the air on times when it's actually a health risk, which is why we have spare the air days, is to abate that activity. So maybe another way we could start to look at it is actually regulate them as polluters, because idling cars circling around streets is not good for the health of people in San Francisco. And it would be interesting, too, to look at where we have, if you look at ABAC data, they actually can show you which neighborhoods are most severely impacted by air pollution, and maybe if we could figure out what the impact of, which is not that different from where you see a lot of TNC. So the downtown area stretching through the Mission to the south side of the city, southeast side of the city is where the greatest and most impact, the greatest impact of poor air quality is felt. So to the degree where those maps align, maybe there's an opportunity to talk to that body, that regulatory agency, and see if we can at least on days like today when we have excessive temperatures and greenhouse gases and other pollutants are being trapped in the air, maybe that's a way that we can have a few less of them on the road when they're actually damaging the health of our citizens. So do we...
Through the chair, on that note, I was just wondering, is there any ability for us, as we are as a city trying to move forward with electrifying our municipal fleet as well as in the private sector as well, to have requirements that TNCs must operate zero-emission vehicles?
So far as I understand, the City of San Francisco does not have the authority to legislate how the TNCs operate kind of any differently than it has the ability to legislate how anyone else operates a private vehicle in the city.
So that would be a change through state law or through, I don't know,
Yes.
some sort of CPUC action?
Yes,
Okay.
and we're in the process of trying to look under as many rocks as we can to figure out all of the different types of ways at the request of the board and the clear interest that the board has expressed to understand what are the what does San Francisco and California regulate in terms of the various different categories of these emerging mobility guiding principles that you may remember you adopted through the Transportation Authority Board a few months ago. To look at all of those, what does San Francisco and California do, and what do other places do, and see what the comparisons are there, and try to get an understanding of what the current situation is. So we're in the process of putting that information together. The preliminary understanding I have from that so far is that San Francisco has very little authority in those terms, and that much more of it lies at the state level.
Okay, thank you.
Supervisor Sheehy?
I still think we need to hear from Doug Johnson from Planning. I think that will be the last agency to present.
Need is a relative term, I would offer. No, it's on the desktop. Yeah. So good afternoon, Supervisors. Doug Johnson, Transportation Planning Manager at the San Francisco Planning Department. I do really appreciate the chance to be able to present here with other city and county agencies. I think it's a great opportunity to get a more holistic picture of what's going on in the city. I'm going to focus a couple slides on some of the recent patterns of development that Jeff alluded to. And in the interest of brevity, I'll just touch verbally on a few initiatives that the planning department has going on right now to address these, some of the issues I've heard you all talking about. I think as Jeff noted, it's really important to note just the scale of development and job growth that we've seen in the city. Since kind of bottoming out in the 70s, there's been substantial amount of growth, and some of the employment growth in particular you see here has occurred very, very quickly. And I think some systems have been slow to catch up. And I think all you have to do is think about Mr. Hobson's photo of the BART platform and how quickly those platforms got so very crowded. I'd say you can see here pretty clearly, but just the long-term trends, again, kind of marking back to 1980, and you see the overall housing supply on a steady growth, population growing, in some cases actually growing a little faster than the number of units, and jobs, after taking a serious dip, have been climbing again at a steeper rate than they've climbed in San Francisco in a very long time. And at least as far as the residential growth, we've seen a lot of it is concentrated in and around downtown. So if you think about where you saw those congestion maps, in addition to accounting for so much, intercity traffic, everybody that wants to go to one of those tech jobs in South San Francisco, they all end up driving across the bridge from the East Bay if they aren't lucky enough to live on the west side of the bay. So it is a combination of kind of development and through traffic, as was mentioned before. And this would just be a reminder that downtown employment, after languishing in the past, is up 5% year over year, which is again, these are really big shocks. 5% might not sound like a lot, but having an extra 13,000 folks downtown, they go shopping, they go to the gym, in addition to all their trips that they might make trying to get in and out of the city or in and out of the financial district from elsewhere in the city. And the planning department's approach is anchored on obviously doing district-level plans and environmental impact reports that allow us to account for comprehensive analysis of transportation impacts and to identify mitigations. Some of the other activities that we have going on right now is basically building out the Transportation Demand Management Ordinance program that was passed last spring, as well as updating the Transportation Impact Analysis Guidelines. Those are guidelines that planning uses during the CEQA process to review project proposals. We work very closely in the development cycle to work with MTA on the curb management of new sites. And I think one of the things, obviously, given the focus on the discussion around the issue of TNCs, we're very excited to hear more about how SFCTA and MTA staff are able to dig further into that data and see what kind of policy implications there may be for us at the planning department. The last thing I'll just mention, you'll be tomorrow at the Transportation Authority Board getting a presentation on Connect SF, which is intended to which will be a presentation touching on how Connect SF is intended to be an integrated set of planning initiatives between the Planning Department, the Transportation Authority, and MTA to seek long-term alignment of city policies. With that, I'll conclude. Happy to take any questions.
No, but I would just say one thing to planning, which is this is now coming up more and more in appeals as well as from folks in the community, which is we need to actually, as we are continuing to invest and develop in the C3 downtown and surrounding neighborhoods, Central Soma, you name it, to really reassess the way we look at cumulative transportation impacts since the creation of this phenomenon that we now call transportation network companies. And we're seeing it in more and more CEQA appeals. And I know you guys don't like CEQA appeals and you write 50 pages of why this doesn't count and doesn't matter and we vote how we vote. But I think that new modeling that really does take into account what we can now demonstrably prove that is not in the modeling that has historically been done by the TA or by planning needs to be undertaken. And I think the board also has a responsibility to start really cranking down, as we have slowly over time, on the amount of on-site parking in new residential development in and around the C3. And I say that also relative to appeals where, I was around when various Market Octavia, you name it, plans were passed that said 0.25 was as of right, a quarter of a parking spot per residential unit, but you could get more with a CU, and it turns out that, and I get it, if somebody asks for more, your commission, staff recommends it, the commission grants it, and we're making our own problem, we're exacerbating our own problem, and it's like you can't have it always. And at some point, we have to get more. I think we are serious about it, and I was around when the sky was the limit, and the board that I served on 15 years ago, tried to do a 0.5. We got away with a 0.75. Our then mayor, Newsom, was not happy about it, and developers were unhappy about it. Guess what? Now everybody's proven that we were not ahead of our time. We were actually probably even slow at getting there. So we've got to continue to do that too. But environmental analysis that really looks at TNCs and congestion has to be a part of the way projects are reviewed, for what it's worth.
Point taken.
Supervisor Tang, Supervisor Sheehy. Is there any public comment? Should we go to public comment? I see that Mr. Gruberg and Mr. Lazarus and Mr. Wiedemeyer has been waiting. Come on up. Mr. Radulovich.
Supervisors, Jim Lazarus, San Francisco Chamber of Commerce, thank you for the hearing today. It was very informative. We've been working very closely the last couple of years with SFMTA. In fact, there's a monthly meeting later this week with the business community, with a variety of people from different sectors downtown, with SFMTA to to constantly look at these issues. What can we do about PCOs at peak times? What are we doing about double parking? Where do bike lanes work and where are they actually aiding or adding to congestion? What's the garage counts? It's interesting with all the talk about ride sharing today. There are thousands of fewer cars driven privately into downtown San Francisco every workday. Ask the department to give you the garage counts. Sutter, Stockton, and Union Square alone, average daily count is down 2,000 cars a day. That has a negative economic impact, perhaps, on SFMTA. Private sector garages, maybe not down a third, but down 15 or 20% a day, because there's a change in use. Your constituents are voting with their feet, so to speak, and they're leaving the car at home or they don't have it because vehicle registrations are also flat in the city compared to population increase. They're doing what you said. They don't have a car. They're using alternative modes of transportation. And we're going to have to learn to live with it. Your constituents, if it's true that 170,000 people a day at peak times are riding one of those 5,000 TNCs that are on the streets of San Francisco at any one time, the people of San Francisco have told you how they want to get around. And we're going to have to work with the state PUC, and locally to accommodate. The reason we can have less than one parking place per unit is people are using alternative ways of transportation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair Peskin, supervisors. I'm glad I stuck around for this item. To follow up on what Jim said, yes, number one, when we are talking about congestion in our city, I think the best thing the city can do is encourage alternative modes of transportation, including biking, walking, and transit, and doing everything we can to make sure that we are a transit-first city and living by what's in our charter. I do want to speak specifically to TNCs and to the numbers that Commander O'Sullivan presented, which surprised even me. He noted that we've had discussions about TNC driver behavior. It is the number one thing that we hear from our members: dangerous and irresponsible, reckless driving behavior from a vehicle that has an Uber or Lyft sticker on it or is delivering for a delivery service. When we talk about what we want from TNCs, accountability and safety is paramount. I am very interested in looking further into some of those numbers with SFPD, and I hope they'll share them. The best thing that we can do is build the kind of streets that make some of that behavior impossible. So talking more about protected bike lanes, I think I'm also interested in ideas that would pilot loading and unloading in commercial corridors where we know there is conflict. Since Tom is here, Tom McGuire from MTA, I'm going to call out one of my favorite pet projects and ideas, which is allowing the reporting of double parking and driving in bike lanes via 311. Currently, if you want to report double parking, whether it's on the sidewalk or on the bike lane, you have to call a phone number, talk to somebody at a desk at MTA Parking Enforcement. We should be able to report those violations via 311. New York City's been doing it for over a year. Imagine how much more data we would have to effectively deploy enforcement resources if 311 was used for double parking violations. So I'm so happy this conversation has started. And I also say we are working and talk directly with Lyft and Uber and other companies and have brought up these issues. So far, I will say we have seen limited progress on the companies themselves taking responsibility beyond some cursory education efforts. We'd like to see them step up and take more responsibility for that behavior. So thank you for convening this conversation, and I look forward to working with the city on what comes out of it. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian.
Hi, Matt Brzezina, independent citizen. I saw today we talked about how we're a transit-first city. I think that's a great slogan. I'm glad we're working towards that. But if you actually look at our city streets, we're definitely a car-first city. 30% of our public right-of-way is used to store people's private vehicles, and the rest of the space is mostly dedicated to private vehicles. So all this talk about TNCs, what we really need to be talking about is them as well as all cars. They're not compatible with a comfortable, safe, environmentally friendly urban environment. I'm not saying get rid of all of them, but reallocate street space to other modes of transportation. What we need to do when we talk about congestion is talk about the movement of people, not the movement of cars. How can we move more people more efficiently? The most efficient means are buses, walking, bicycles, and as Scott Wiener, our former representative, said, San Francisco should always be building a subway. I don't know if there's a subway planned after the Central Subway. And a little tip for everybody here that is really focused on SOMA, where we're seeing most of this congestion. We got bike lanes on 7th and 8th, protected bike lanes. If you want to get more people biking in that area, which is a very efficient, very cheap way to get more people moving around that area, build protected bike lanes on every single one of those other streets. They are massively wide. And you know what time of day is my favorite time to ride on those streets? The time of day when they are congested, because that's when it's actually safe enough for my family to ride on those streets. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Thank you, supervisors. Thank you, Supervisor Sheehy, for bringing this hearing up. What I heard here was shocking, certainly, but not surprising to anybody who drives the streets. And those of us out on the streets see the kind of behavior that's reflected in the numbers that Commander O'Sullivan brought forward. We see this every day, every shift, multiple times. And I think this is the most serious part of this whole equation, although there are multiple other parts, including the environment and so forth, because this directly affects public safety. And if your Vision Zero plans are ever to come to fruition, you have to get a handle on the driving habits of TNC drivers. This stems, in my mind, from the very top. There is a culture of contempt for the law that goes to the very beginnings of TNCs, to Uber, and also to Lyft, which was the company, after all, that introduced the private vehicle to this equation, completely without any legal authority whatsoever. And this has come down to their drivers, who are untrained, untested, unpermitted, and really treat the streets as a kind of a Wild West. So I would ask the city to seriously take another look at your legal authority, both to directly regulate TNCs and in other ways to indirectly, through regulations that apply to everybody, regulate them in that way. I'd say take a look at the public nuisance laws, because what's going on the streets is definitely a public nuisance. And, take back your streets. Thank you.
Mr. Radulovich.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Tom Radulovich, Executive Director of Livable City. Thanks for hearing on a big and complex problem. I've been sort of a transportation watcher in this city for a few decades, and there's a lot of moving parts to this. One of the things that's disturbing is it feels like as a city, despite or maybe because of the multiplicity of transportation agencies we have, we're not working off a city plan. We don't have a strategy for dealing with transportation, for dealing with demand management. So it's great to see all the agencies here, but we hope you'll keep the fire lit under them to continue working together. Despite all the constraints under state law, I think there's many things the city can do to relieve traffic congestion, encourage people to use sustainable modes of transportation. One is focus on allocation of public right-of-way. The public right-of-way is public. City agencies allocate how it's used. We need more protected bike lanes. We need more exclusive transit lanes in the city. We need safer walking in this city, wider sidewalks, and pedestrian priority in the city. You can focus on management of the curb. I think we do a pretty bad job managing how curb space is allocated. We set up a conflict years ago between taxis and bikes, and by not setting up exclusive taxi zones in places, and then with the TNCs, it's only got worse. So we really need a curb management strategy and priorities. I live off of Valencia Street. It's completely unregulated after 6 o'clock, which is when all the action is. So, nobody can park, nobody can load, etc. You need to look at parking on and off street. Off-street parking, according to your own study, is your biggest leverage point in terms of shifting travel behavior. How much private parking is in new developments. So when projects like One Oak come forward in a very congested area already, all the development Van Essen Market, it's way too much parking in it. So these are all leverage that we have as a city, and we hope we'll use them intelligently and begin to chip away at this problem. Thank you.
Are there any other members of the public for public comment? Seeing none, public comment is closed. Supervisor Sheehy.
Yes, and I want to thank all the city departments for coming today. I think we learned a lot. We learned some things we didn't know before, and I look forward to working on this issue with all of you and with my colleagues, and thank you.
Thank you. Would you like this matter to be filed or continue to the call of the chair?
I think continue to the call of the chair.
All right, then without objection, we will continue item number 1 to the call of the chair, and that concludes our hearing. We are adjourned.